Hello and welcome. I'm Yvonne Chan in Singapore, and you're watching FIA Dialogues. It's possibly one of the biggest science stories of the decade, CRISPR technology. Essentially, it means gene edit technology that is fast, relatively simple, and has extraordinary potential for a range of sectors: agriculture, medicine, and the food industry. FIA and Corteva Agriscience bring you this morning's edition on day 2 of our live-streamed FIA Dialogues. Today, you'll hear expert speakers debate the potential benefits and limitations of this technology from across the food value chain. Over the next hour, we bring you insights from the experts, followed by today's panel debate, Enhancing Food Security Through New Technology. Then there's the opportunity for you to ask questions of the experts during a live Q&A. Simply ask your questions by typing them directly in the chat box on the right-hand side of the YouTube live stream at any time. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. But first, if you're not familiar with CRISPR technology, here's a short explanatory video from Corteva Agriscience.
Is CRISPR safe?
Yes, CRISPR is safe. People have been eating CRISPR since the invention of yogurt. The enzyme that we're talking about exists naturally in bacteria used to create yogurt.
But in reality, we're not talking about something we eat. CRISPR is not even in the plants, the products, anything that we sell. It's not in the final plant. It's just a tool to get us to the plant that we want in a faster way than breeding. All of the products we sell, whether created by CRISPR or not, are safe for the environment and people. So Jeff, when we talk about the benefits of products created with CRISPR, what are you most excited about?
I have to go beyond agriculture here. For me, it's really the health benefits and the curing of diseases in the human therapeutics.
Well, I'll keep it in agriculture. I'm really excited about the ability for us to impact browning. So when I cut up apples and put them in my kids' lunch, I want to make sure they don't throw them away because they're brown when they get to lunchtime, all that waste. I'm excited about some of those applications.
During this Dialogues series, you will have noticed how much innovation seems to be going on in the food and beverage sector. And on August 12th, we launched 4 episodes of FIA's Food for the Future TV news program, which includes a close-up look at innovation and also health and nutrition, resilience, and sustainability. Here's a preview of some of the innovators providing positive solutions and exciting new technologies.
Which industries would you identify as the ones that are facing big opportunities as a result of COVID-19?
Any company has an ability to take advantage of a situation like this or to grow in a situation like this if they're able to pivot, to adjust, to innovate in this space. So that's something that we see as really important, and that's why I think market intelligence is sort of that key aspect there, because we can provide them with the data, with the understanding of how the consumers are behaving, and being able to really target that area.
Congestion. It's part of our modern lives. But bottlenecks are never welcome, especially in food and beverage manufacturing, where blockages in production can be disastrous. An Enterprise Resource Planning System, or ERP, can help overcome the most complex production roadblocks.
Effectively, an ERP system can integrate everything from planning to purchasing, to inventory, to sales. It really is critical.
CISPRO says its software is easy to use but powerful enough to give businesses a 360-degree view of their operations, enabling them to avoid the bottlenecks that can literally choke a business.
But now we return to Greg Ward with our FIA Dialogues expert panelists to debate Enhancing Food Security Through New Technology. Take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Yvonne. Welcome now to our panel discussion on CRISPR technology. And joining us today, Ditte Sidelmann Brink from Novozymes, Cory Christensen from Corteva Agriscience, and Dr. Randal Giroux from Cargill. Well, perhaps before we get started, we should really ask ourselves, what is this CRISPR technology all about? So maybe, Cory, could you perhaps provide us some brief background on what the technology is and what the potential might be?
Thanks, Greg. CRISPR is a method that's part of a family of technologies that are referred to as genome editing or plant breeding innovation or new breeding technologies. And in short, what CRISPR is a method that allows you to target very specific changes to a DNA sequence. That can be the deletion of a piece of that sequence, an addition, or a small edit to the genetic code of an organism. And the reason why that's important is because it allows you to, for the first time, target changes in a very specific way that can introduce beneficial characteristics to a plant or animal.
And so in terms of perspective, how excited are you by its potential?
I'm very excited. Over the last several decades, we have the agricultural industry, mankind in general, has accumulated vast amounts of knowledge about the genomes of plants and animals and humans, and the causative variation that exists that produces many of the beneficial phenotypes or many of the diseases that we see has been understood. And now CRISPR is a tool that allows you to go in and mitigate some of those diseases or pathogens, or to provide beneficial characteristics in a way that was previously quite difficult or inefficient or perhaps not even possible.
Randal, I'll come to you now. Is CRISPR going to be a silver bullet for overcoming food and health challenges we currently face?
Right. So, yeah, from our perspective, CRISPR comes at a time where we're really seeing a convergence between really strong computing power and the knowledge and understanding of biology and genetics. And so, really, CRISPR just builds off of a group of other digital technologies and analytical technologies, and just comes really at the right time. There's a lot of incredibly smart people working in agriculture and in research, looking at some of the most vexing problems we have in production agriculture in the global food system. And so while CRISPR is getting a lot of attention, or CRISPR, I like to call gene editing, it really is building off of a number of additional technologies that we have in agriculture that we're bringing to bear on some of those most critical problems.
Ditte, you heard Randal mention that it's getting plenty of attention. Are you equally excited? Does CRISPR deserve all the attention it's getting right now?
Yes, to us, it's very important that we look at biological answers to many of the world's challenges today. And for us, gene editing, across CRISPR being one technology, is for sure one of the things that will provide some of the solutions that is needed across the food chain, across agricultural solutions and so on.
Cory, what are the gaps in most people's understanding of this technology?
Probably one of the primary gaps, and for most people, they might have heard about CRISPR. It's getting a little more attention in the news lately with respect to human health applications. People are probably largely unfamiliar with its applications in agriculture. And when they do and they hear about genome editing, they immediately think about GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, transgenics. And so it's important to make a distinction between a genetically modified organism and gene editing. And in a GMO, a gene has been taken from another species and introduced into the target species. So those types of changes could confer insect control or herbicide tolerance. When we're talking about genome editing, we're talking about making changes within the genome of the target organism. And so there is no transfer of genetic material between species. And so that's probably one of the most significant areas of where it's important to have an understanding about what we're talking about with genome editing in particular.
And Randal, are you aware of any other shortcomings in the way people understand CRISPR technology?
Yes, from our vantage point in Cargill, we're sit between the farmers who produce or grow these gene-edited products and our consumers at the other end of those agricultural supply chains. While we've done a great job of explaining the technology and the applications of that technology, I think generally people don't understand that the complexities of moving those products across borders, particularly when countries create different regulatory frameworks or different approval processes for these types of products. So in the global food system, food has got to move. And so the ability of us to fully integrate that technology into the global food system for us to address some of the complexities and the patchwork of regulatory challenges out there. That's for us one of the biggest considerations in being able to adopt this technology broadly in the food system.
Perhaps now's a good time to look at the big picture. I'd like to ask each of you what you would identify as the biggest challenges now facing the food industry. Let's go to you first, Ditte. What would you say are the biggest challenges facing the food industry right now?
Yes, I believe there's many challenges. We all know that we have scarce resources. We all want a new way of producing food. I think we know that we need to be more efficient on raw materials, on energy. We need to produce less waste. And it's also important in some instances that we get the consumers' confidence reinstalled when it comes to food safety and maybe also how we work around exactly regulating the safety of food.
And how will Novozymes respond to those big challenges?
To Novozymes, it's very important that the whole purpose of Novozymes is to bring biological solutions to the world to improve have better lives in a growing world. We produce enzymes to make the food processing more efficient, but we also work with microorganisms. And to imagine a future where the microorganisms are providing the nitrogen needed for the plants in the field instead of chemical fertilizers, I think that would be a big step forward. And again, a future with probiotics instead of too many antibiotics would also be a great benefit to all of us.
Cory, what's the perspective from Corteva? What do you see as the big challenges and how will you accommodate them?
Yeah, I think those that Ditte identified are really important. Corteva's purpose is to enrich the lives of those who produce and those who consume. And for those who produce, significant challenges around a changing climate, increased pests and diseases. The plants are under constant assault and the farmers battling those challenges constantly. On the consumer side, we see a growing middle class. As Ditte pointed out, an increasing desire for more nutritious and safe food supply. At the same time, in society, we see trends towards decreasing use of chemical pesticides or other inputs. And so these are some challenges to the food production system. And at Corteva, we are bringing a whole host of technical approaches to trying to solve those problems and address those needs of consumers and societies, whether it's biologicals, genome editing, improving the way we develop chemistries to make them more environmentally friendly. So Corteva is in an advantage position to provide an integrated set of solutions, including digital applications where we can monitor and more effectively target treatments and solutions.
And Randal, would you agree that perhaps food waste and increasing food demand need to be added to the list as well?
Yeah, for sure, these are significant challenges for a global food system. But for us, in that global food system, I would say science matters, but we've also recognized that emotion is important in the global food system and for consumers. And so we have to figure out how to make the best use of science and technology in feeding a hungry world. At Cargill, we know that we look at things like biotechnology, alternative proteins, new approaches to growing plants and technology. And while all of these are very important for us to get the full benefits of this technology, we've got to find a way to bring consumers along, to get acceptance and to build trust with consumers around the integration of technology in the food system. Everybody's talking about sustainability, and the road to sustainability is paved with innovation. And so how then do we find a way to build trust with consumers and bring them along so that they start to pull these technologies through our agricultural supply chains, and so we can integrate that technology into that global food system?
Those innovations you've already mentioned, I mean, are these time consuming? Are you keeping pace with change?
Yeah, it's pretty common that technology moves ahead of governments in regulation, and so we're constantly in a place where we're trying to get governments and regulations and standards to catch up with the technologies. I think that's a critical role for governments, and we look to governments to help us assure the safety of these products and to find ways and create agricultural policies and approaches that allow us to integrate those technologies in a way that we don't create disruptions in trade, that we have free access to markets, and that our consumers are demanding them and pulling them into those food systems.
Randal, another question for you. We've seen a trend of companies trying to grow food in areas not previously possible. Is that something your business has tried to do?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I work for a large agricultural company, and it has always been important for us to make sure that we have the most efficient and cost-effective systems in place to bring products from the farm all the way through to finished consumers. And it really always has been a critical decision on where we place plants relative to those consumers and relative to the producers, the farmers who are growing those products. It's interesting as people talk about trying to localize the growth of crops, but from Cargill's perspective, we do really strongly believe in the concept of comparative advantage, and that crops should be grown in the areas where they can be grown most efficiently with the least inputs and in the most effective ways, and then to move those products into position either for manufacturing or distribution. And so while I understand the concept, for us to maximize the efficiencies of agriculture and improve the sustainability of agriculture, this concept of comparative advantage and growing crops where they grow best, to utilize farmers where they can be most effective is more important than trying to save on food miles.
And Ditte, your thoughts on this? Do you think there are benefits or disadvantages in trying to grow food in areas not previously possible?
I think to us it's important that we have the right regulatory framework, that we ensure that what is regulated is not the product in itself, or is exactly the product in itself, and not the process and the way it has been produced. Again, back to the technology really moving forward fast. It's more or less impossible to regulate whether it's one technology being used or the other. We really need to look at the safety of the end product, and by that ensuring the safety of the product and the confidence of the consumers.
Well, before we wrap up our discussion today, let's end perhaps by looking ahead 12 months and finding out from each of you what excites you most about the year ahead. Let's start with you, Cory. When you look ahead for the next 12 months, what excites you most about what lies in front?
12 months is, for an agricultural biotechnology company, a relatively short period of time to be looking ahead, because our product development cycles can be 5 or 10 years. But I am excited about developments around the world with respect to the regulatory policy. For example, there have been some, and we have touched a little bit on that today. Some places where regulatory policy has taken a challenging and unfortunate turn. For example, in the EU, but in other places, in Japan, for instance, recently we've seen positive developments on a policy front. The U.S. has recently articulated Part 340 and regulatory policy with respect to genome editing, and as Dr. Giroux pointed out, getting that regulatory policy in place and harmonized is really important for being able to foster an innovative environment. And so we're encouraged about that. Corteva's actively engaged globally across the policy front, and I look forward to additional advancements and helping folks understand and gain trust. That's the other thing that Dr. Giroux pointed out, is that I think really critical for the technology and for agriculture in general is for society to develop trust in what those who are developing that technology are doing. And so I think on two fronts there, building trust with society, listening to and understanding consumers and what they need, which is something Corteva is actively involved in, and then continuing to advocate for sound regulatory policy so that we can bring this innovative technology to market and impact some of these significant challenges that we're facing is the things that I'm most excited about and expect to see continued progress over the next 12 months and beyond.
Randal, I'll loosen the reins for you somewhat. What excites you most when you look ahead, perhaps 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Thanks for that additional bandwidth. I work in agriculture. Our company is engaged across the agricultural supply chain, and I'm constantly amazed by the resilience and agility that we have in our agricultural producer base all over the world, right? I'm most excited to see how we continue to find ways to integrate technology into that global food system, to continue to work with, see how governments around the world react and start to develop agricultural policy that allows us to integrate those technologies in a way that we can move them. Food's got to move from places of abundance to places of deficit. And then how do we then marry that technology and the benefits that it can bring to production agriculture, to sustainability, to public health, to nutrition? How do we marry that technology and allow producers the flexibility to grow that technology, yet at the same time create an environment in the global food system that allows us to use that technology to cross borders, for agricultural policy and regulation to develop in a way that really enables us to integrate that technology. It's when that technology gets into the global food system that we really see the power and benefits of that technology for the food system, for our consumers, and for those involved in agriculture. That's the most exciting thing that could happen for me in the next 5 years.
And finally, Ditte, there are obviously big challenges facing the food industry, but when you look ahead, say 3 to 5 years, what excites you most?
I'm as excited that Novozymes can be a part of bringing the solutions to the world, together with our customers, and really engaging with all consumers into the important debates that we need to have around using gene editing across the food and feed chain. I think we need to speak to what difference it can make from a sustainability point of view, that we can imagine a world without artificial chemistry and fertilizers, without pesticides, that we can have much longer shelf lives and much healthier and safer foods to the customers and consumers. And to me, this is what it's all about. I think if we use the technology in the right way, that we regulate it, and everything should be regulated, and we need to take care of the safety of our products, but really look at the products and not how they are made. Whether it's with a brand new technology or an old technology, everything needs to be safe, and we can ensure that together, and then bring this technology forward, bring new products to the market, and together be in a much better place feeding the world.
Well, thank you all members of the panel. Thank you, Ditte, Cory and Randal. Let's hope that CRISPR does deliver, and good luck as you take on those challenges in the years ahead. Thank you very much. And now back to you, Yvonne.
Well, shortly, we'll be crossing to our live Q&A session, where a panel of experts is waiting to answer your questions about food security and new technologies like CRISPR. If you haven't already, please post your questions directly on this live stream on the right-hand side in the chat box. The moderator for this session is Vice President of Bits and Bytes, Winnie Leung. Over to you, Winnie.
Thanks, Yvonne. My name is Winnie. I am with Bits and Bytes, and I'm happy to give you, with the panelists, a further discussion based on the last session's introduction to CRISPR, to hopefully dive in more nuances of these key topics and get a sense of how we got here and where can we expect the market for CRISPR will go. So perhaps I'll start with introducing the speakers on the call. We have Ian Godwin, who's the director of Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation. Ian is also the author of the book Good Enough to Eat: Next Generation GM Crops, and it's helpful for those interested in learning about the history of misinformation around plant sciences. We have Vincent Sewalt, who is the head regulatory science and advocacy at DuPont Nutrition and Biosciences. Vincent recently authored a paper that looked at the regulatory oversight of GE foods and microorganisms. Last but not least, we have Doyle Carr, who is the director of consumer insights and social license of Corteva Agrisciences. Doyle has 30 years of experience communicating around agricultural issues, and we look forward to hearing his experience over the year. So let's dive into the communication around CRISPR. Doyle, it's okay, I'll start with you.
Okay.
CRISPR companies have the benefit from learning from predecessors. So there's a lot of studies over the years that have tracked consumer sentiments for GM crops, and also look at how the technology companies, seed companies, have taken different approaches to communicate with consumers. I'd love to hear from you, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from GM crops that will really help position CRISPR for better consumer acceptance down the road?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me here today. It's a real privilege. And to start with, one of the main things that we've learned is that this all sort of boils down to the issue of trust. And if you don't have trust, your arguments, your suggestions, your influence, whatever you want, isn't going to do much good. So we got to start with that notion of how are we being trustworthy. And in order to be trustworthy, you've got to start with some shared values with the people you're talking to, and acknowledge that we have some of the similar interests. We know that shared values are 3 to 5 times more important in a conversation than facts and figures. If starting there and thinking about, so where are we alike? What are our interests alike? Are we both interested in the planet? Are we families and those kind of things? And of course, then transparency is key to getting that shared value there. So, and there's plenty of exciting research going on today, as well as we dig into specific consumers in specific countries and those kind of things. But I think that notion of trustworthiness is paramount.
And I'm sure that in the conversations that you've had, a lot of people are asking you, what's the difference between GM and CRISPR? Do you find that comparison helpful in guiding people through the understanding of why CRISPR is just slightly different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to talk about it, but what we found in focus groups and talking to consumers about this and trying different approaches to say, how do they best understand what's important, or how do we connect with them? It's really important to start first with what's the challenge you're trying to solve, and demonstrate then to, once you've talked about that challenge, come back behind it with saying, and here's a technology that can help. We see very consistently, if you start the conversation with, there's GMOs and CRISPRs are different, that we know that we will never get beyond talking about the GMOs and the challenges and those kind of things. So start with the challenges, like what are we trying to solve for? Are we trying to improve nutrition? Are we trying to make better for the climate? What is it that we're trying to do? See if they value that. And if they do, then say, here's how we plan to do it. And you'll eventually get to that question. This sounds like GMOs. And even if you have that conversation later on, they still will end up saying, this sounds reasonable. That's something that I would be interested in learning more about.
Thank you. Ian, I'll move on to you. I'd love to hear from you on this topic as well, especially your perspective as a scientist. Consumers are increasingly looking more for natural products, less chemicals, and CRISPR can obviously create seeds that are more resistant and hence have less need for having a lot of chemicals applied by the farmers. At the same time, we're seeing that there's an anti-science undertone that is challenging technology used in food production, and CRISPR is kind of sitting in the middle. So in conversations, do you have any tips for finding middle ground, or preventing a we versus them kind of debate?
Yeah, it's a really hard one to get to grips with as a scientist, because I started genetically modifying plants back in 1987, and we thought this was going to save the world, and then the world actually said 6 or 7 years later, actually we don't know if we want this stuff. So coming from that background and thinking about how can we demonstrate what CRISPR can do for us, the things that drive a lot of people in the choices that they make with food is, what does this food give me? And it might be a feeling of well-being, it might be a health thing, or it might even be some people are buying particular foods because they feel that that food is more environmentally sustainable. And you're right, when it comes to the natural, CRISPR can deliver some of those things. So for example, I mean, potatoes, a lot of people eat potatoes. I love French fries. And most potatoes actually have to get sprayed multiple times during a season because of fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, and pests. We can deliver almost 100% spray-free potatoes by tweaking a couple of genes in the potato genome. And they're just mutations that could have occurred naturally and have actually occurred naturally in some of the wild relatives, but we can't get the genes from the wild relatives into the cultivated potato. So once we understand the genetics of that, if we can just make these couple of little tweaks, these mutations in a potato that delivers these resistances, we can start to think about growing potatoes without those chemical inputs.
There's a notion here, though, a bit of a distinction between what's science and what's technology. And some people distrust science just because of the fact that the concept really is all about discovery. It's about figuring out what's going on in nature, but without much control. Now, technology is really a step up from that, and some consumers find that a little bit more reassuring because it does convey a sense of control, a sense of building on nature, so to speak. So tech is cool. Even tech in food is becoming cooler these days. So maybe a choice of words away from science and more into food tech, right, might be helpful there as well.
I think it also goes back to what Doyle was mentioning earlier in terms of focusing on the challenge that we're seeking to solve. There's an audience question here that is directed to Doyle. So Doyle, I'll put you on the spot. So the question is, with nearly 10 billion people to feed by 2050, what role can this technology play in feeding the future?
Well, I think it has an incredible opportunity to solve some really challenging problems, but it also, I think, keep it in context, it is one of many tools that we have to deploy. And even to do a gene edit, you have to have a lot of other information on that plant, on the organism you're investigating, and lots of other technologies working together to make that happen. So I think if we start with that question, the challenge of feeding 10 billion people, and work our way back, and there's things that can be done from an agronomy standpoint. There's things that we can be doing from a sustainability about how we till the ground and all those things to make sure the nutrients are there for the next crop, along with crossbreeding, along with lots of other ways of managing that crop to deliver what we need in their supply chain, blockchain, lots of opportunities if we start with that challenge and then work our way back and then say, yes, gene editing has an incredible opportunity. It can help us be more climate resilient. It can help with nutrition. There's lots of things that it can do, but it is just one tool in a large tool set.
Thank you, Doyle. So I will move on to discussing the regulatory issues. So perhaps Vincent, you can help us dissect this one. So right now, there's only a number of countries that have indicated how CRISPR will fit within their legal framework. So how do you think that these decisions are being made? Do you think they are made to reflect the consumer sentiments in the countries, or do you think it's more to do with the food security concerns, priorities in these countries? So just wanted to get a sense of how we might be able to predict where the rest of the world will go.
Well, thank you for that question. I think there's a little bit of both, right? So in some societies, it is the food security aspects that technologies like CRISPR and other technologies can contribute to solving, and that becomes the driver for regulators and governments, right, to think about regulatory frameworks. In other societies, it actually is consumer sentiment, which can be negative, right, that ends up driving where governments do cater to that public opinion. So if the public opinion is negative, the regulatory framework towards a technology usually becomes more protective, if you will, protecting the consumers. So both are interplayed. It does also coincide with different viewpoints of regulators to look at new technologies, products, right, made with new technologies, and whether they are process focused. And if it's a new technology, the process is new, right? It's unknown. Therefore, you need to be more cautious, is the mindset. As opposed to regulatory frameworks that really look at the final product and whether the final product is safe in a very objective manner based on compositional analysis and possibly aspects of the technology that may lead to adverse effects, if you will. But yeah, so those are the two different camps, and without really going into details as to which countries follow which type of philosophy, there's two distinct ones, and both are spreading, if you will, from established jurisdictions like EU and the US, right, into emerging markets.
And I'll probably ask the same question to Ian here, particularly curious in the driver in Australia. Obviously, Australia declared that they will it will be friendly in terms of the regulations to CRISPR, and as a Chinese market investor here at Bits and Bytes, we're quite excited to see that, and wanted to hear from you what is the driver in Australia that led to that decision.
Yeah, the driver in Australia was really for the our federal Office of Gene Technology Regulator went entirely down the process, and they said the process is if you're using simple editing and not introducing any DNA, it's not going to be regulated, which was great, but we would have preferred them to go actually to the product side of things, like for example Canada and the US are much more in that direction. And the reason for that is because the product is what people are going to eat, people are going to use in the food chain, and it sort of makes sense to us that would be a better way to look at regulating the whole process. I would then say the other thing that we in the academic community really feel a lot is uncertainty when it comes to commercialization. There's two aspects to that. One is we still don't know who has the patent rights, separate thing altogether. But secondly, we're always asked, well, because Australia is an export market driven agriculture system. 2/3 of our agricultural produce feeds other people other than Australia. And so it's a big driver in our trade. But it also means we have to think about, well, what's the market? If the market for the moment is in the European Union, we might have to make very, very different judgments as to whether we want to actually commercialize this than compared to if our market is in North America or North Asia. And that's a problem that regulations has made, has delivered to us at the moment.
Yeah, so these are basically the trade implications, right, of oversight decisions, right, in specific markets, which can be quite extensive. One more final comment on the process versus product issue. So you can have theoretical situations where CRISPR-based crops, if you will, may not be acceptable, right, in the EU at this time, even though the composition of these crops and even at the genetic level, right, the gene sequence, right, of the genome is identical of what occurs in nature or what it could have been achieved by traditional breeding. So you're really disadvantaging the consumers, right, from having access to food that is established, right, with this particular technology.
I like that. I like that process versus product comparison. One of the things that we're observing in China is that China has seemed to indicate its openness to breeding technology, but it's still the fact that it's cleared approvals for several GM crops, including herbicide-resistant corn and soy. But in terms of how they intend to regulate this in a more systematic way, it's still kind of a long way to go. And I think looking at what's happening in Australia, what's happening in the US and Canada, that will be helpful to understand where the government will take it. So one question from the audience, and this is for Ian. Can CRISPR be applied across the food value chain, or is it more at the farm or upstream side of the business?
Well, yes. I mean, CRISPR can be applied across the food chain, because when we have, for example, a farmed product that then gets processed by fermentation or something like that, so CRISPR can actually be applied into the organisms that are undergoing those fermentation changes. I mean, a typical example would be, for example, beer. The technology exists for you to be able to CRISPR edit the yeasts that you use to put into the brewing process. Some of those, for example, will actually make a higher quality product. For example, a product that lasts longer, doesn't get things like chill haze. Chill haze being you put your bottle in the fridge in a bottle shop, and after 2 months, the beer goes slightly cloudy, and you have to throw it out. But we know what causes that, and we also know that you could use CRISPR in the yeast so that it doesn't actually, it changes the process by which it ferments slightly. The beer will taste exactly the same, but it will have a longer shelf life.
I love that, Ian, during our preparation call and also this one, you have so many references from alcohol fermentation.
It's a major food group.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question also from the audience, and this is for Vincent. Many governments across Asia are tightening regulations against genetically modified foods. How will CRISPR be impacted by these regulations?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, and indeed, it's going to depend on how the governments will regard CRISPR as a technology, or whether they will be looking at sort of the outcome, right, of products made with CRISPR. It will require a lot of dialogue between industry, academia, experts, and governments. And like what Doyle was talking about earlier, it will take exploration of where we can align, right? Where are the aligned values? Not limited to consumers, but also with the governments, right? So if the government of China has certain ambitions to establish export markets, for example, then that's an intention that industry can, I would say, benefit from, right, in terms of acceptance of CRISPR. So over time, I do think that governments in emerging markets will accept CRISPR. There's even some early signs in the very European Union, where even in certain countries like Germany, the Green Party is starting to think, at least internally, about gene editing and whether or not it should differentiate gene editing from traditional GMO. So there's some early signs, even in the EU, that the thinking is changing. And of course, once the EU changes course, in the end, a lot of emerging markets that follow the EU will also change course. So I think part of the debate needs to happen within the emerging markets, but a lot of it actually is going to happen in the EU, and it will have quite a bit of impact.
Just a point of curiosity, Vincent. So I know that in China, when in the early stages of working on GM regulations, there was a consortium of the largest seed companies that were working together to collaborate with the government to figure out what is the best way to regulate certain crops and what might be some of the crops that might have a greenway for easier regulations. So in the case of Southeast Asia, is that type of industry consortium happening right now to collaborate with the government to look at what is the best way to regulate some of these newer technologies?
It's happening, but probably not enough. Basically because Asia is quite diverse, if you will, and not as well organized in terms of trade associations. Of course, there are trade associations operating in Asia, like Food Industry Asia, but relative to the experience and influence, right, it's still relatively early days. I do want to quote a recent effort, and that was actually a result of the trade negotiations between the US and China, where as part of those trade negotiations, the GMO regulations were put up for debate and for improvement. And as a result, there now is a lot of work going on at the technical level, right, to hammer out so-called GMM regulations. So with the final M standing for microbes, right, where we will be seeing the borders of China opening for microbes made with CRISPR and other technologies, including traditional recombinant DNA. And so yeah, so that happens to be a specific case where bilateral negotiations between two countries actually, about trade in general, ended up opening the doors for a relatively small technology segment as well.
Doyle, if I can ask you also on this topic of cross-sector collaboration, specifically around consumer education and forming the right public education strategy. Do you see that collaboration happening around CRISPR of companies that are developing these technologies, companies on the corporate level looking to partner with one another to form a plan to educate societies on what are the benefits of CRISPR and where this technology can go?
Yes, absolutely. And I think kind of this recognition that regulatory approvals oversight is very important, but it's important but not sufficient. There's this whole other side of societal permission that we have to pay attention to very early in development. And so that leads to the activities that I've been doing. But we, as part of that, working with folks in gene editing and human health, in conservation, and just pure research, and saying, what are those questions that society has? And it's kind of amazing. We work very siloed, and kind of when, the folks in the human health arena who are working on really critical, important, and yet, challenging areas to make gene editing work, their biggest fear, agriculture. You know what, the folks in agriculture, we're working through it, and we've got some experience. We think we can do some things. What's the biggest fear of folks in agriculture? The medical side. So it's a little of that. And then you pull it back a little bit and you start talking about, okay, trust. Now, the trust that we need in agriculture, the specifics are different, but, folks in human health have some issues with trust. And and how they're putting together these stories and who's going to give oversight and those kind of things. So we immediately started seeing some opportunities to work together. CRISPRcon.org is a great place to go if you just want to be exposed to those questions and see dialogue with critics, next to advocates, next to people from religious communities, farmers, all those kind of together, kind of talking about what is this technology and what does society need to understand it. And then I think then you come back to that question of what is the problem you're trying to solve and put it in context. And that'll get us back into kind of the specific applications and their merit within that discussion.
That sounds like a good resource for us to all look at. The next is an audience question. So I'll direct this to Ian, if that's okay. So the question is around biodiversity. Is gene editing, is CRISPR a good thing for biodiversity, or is it a foe?
I think it actually is a positive. And one of the, again, if we sort of conflate the association with GM, one of the arguments about GM is it has reduced biodiversity. It probably hasn't, but one of the things that it has done, for example, is that there's very few plant species that are actively commercially grown as GM. And part of the reason for that is because the costs of getting things through the regulatory acceptance are so high that you're not likely to make any money out of genetically modified asparagus or pumpkins, etc. Whereas with CRISPR, because CRISPR is an easy technology to apply as a plant breeding technology, and the fact that it's broadly applicable right across the food chain, I think we're going to see that there's actually a bonus in the terms of the biodiversity that is going on farm, because some of the things that have been difficult to grow and to make money out of in the past are much more likely to become profitable organizations, at least locally.
And I might add, the work that's going on in conservation is incredible, and the opportunity for gene editing working in that, native birds in Hawaii that are being taken out by mosquitoes. And, so what are the opportunities to control mosquitoes better in order to allow those the birds to continue to have the habitat and all the things they need. And many of these kind of full ecosystems, but also part of the recognition of a lot of these projects are understanding the importance of the local community and how do we engage. And so this is the kind of things I'm learning about through these engagement, and there's some of that on CRISPRcon.org, but just some incredible stuff in conservation, just protecting the animals that we have that may not exist unless we have some kind of intervention somewhere in that ecosystem.
One audience question from Ryan Tay. Perhaps Vincent, you can take this. What are the considerations to balance if gene editing is necessary for better nutrition or pest resistance?
Right. The considerations to balance. So one of the things about gene editing is it's much more convenient, right, to create new traits and to be much more precise about them as well. And it's likely also more convenient to combine traits. And it's easier to decouple traits that are inherently coupled to one another in the genome or on specific segments of the chromosome. So using gene editing, it now becomes possible to create crops that have higher nutritional value, yet that are still also more resistant to pests, right, or drought resistant. So there's going to be more versatility and possible. So and fewer compromises.
And I love that question, by the way, because what we know is you get the best conversations and kind of start to coalesce around certain approaches when you discuss it from a dilemma perspective. Mm-hmm. So it's not, should there be more regulation, thumbs up, or should there be more of these kind of things, thumbs down. It's okay, you like the idea that this is a technology that has startups and academics and others actually have access to, and it's easier for folks to use it, so it's more of a democratic type technology. So that's great, but yet you still want oversight. So how much oversight is that? And if you pile on too much, pretty soon the only folks that are going to be able to do the gene editing are not the academics and the small companies and the folks with real challenges in a minor crop. It's going to be the majors that have large research investment dollars and those kind of things. So that's a dilemma, right? What is that balance between oversight and access? And similarly, just even looking at, there's trade-offs between what you do with a crop when you want more nutrition. Can you get that from somewhere else easier, or does it make sense here? And it's those kind of questions in a group setting, diverse group setting, that you actually get some really cool kind of eloquent solutions versus just the kind of thumbs up, down, let's take a poll and move on kind of thing.
Doyle, I love the fact you pull in the oversight question, right? And indeed, heavy oversight makes it nearly impossible for startups or academics, right, to actually practice genetic improvements. And that's just what CRISPR actually enables, easier access and easier execution of the technology. Now, what this does require is a decent amount of what we call product stewardship. So this is really where companies, industry sets its own standards, often in collaboration, right, with academic experts and governments, but where we operate under stewardship principles. That has the potential to fill the gap, or to to strict regulations, or to enable regulations to loosen up a little bit and not become prohibitive.
So we have two more questions, and we're running up the end of the hour here. So the second last question is an audience question, and this is for Ian from Anna. Can CRISPR be used to remove genes in agricultural products that can make it an allergen?
Yes. Yeah, the answer to that is yes. It gets a bit more complex, however. So, for example, you can use CRISPR to make peanuts that don't make people have an allergic reaction to peanuts. The same with wheat. The more complex side of it is, it comes back to what was being said earlier about stewardship. You have to be able to know that you are just selling that product. If you get contamination into your allergen-free peanuts by normal peanuts, there's an element of risk there that makes it really, really a difficult challenge for people to consider as being something that they feel is a good market. So the technical part of the problem is easy. The delivery and safety post-farm gate in this way is actually the more challenging part of the equation.
So on the topic of traits, so I want to ask all three speakers on the call one last question, and this is a fun question. So we at Bits and Bytes, as investors, we think a lot about the commercial value and the impact of the traits that a startup is targeting at. But forget about commercial value, forget about impact for the world. For you guys, since we all like foods, and we all think a lot about what makes us happy as eaters. So if you were to pick one CRISPR product to develop just for yourself, what will you use CRISPR for? So Vincent, let's start with you, and then on to Doyle.
All right, thank you for me to bite off this fun question. I had all kinds of examples in my mind that were going to be super useful globally around the world, solve global hunger and all that, those sorts of things. But now that you're asking me to come up with a fun product, I would say probiotics. Probiotics, with specific traits CRISPR'd into them. and there's many different traits you could think about, including healthy nutrition traits and so on and so forth. Probiotics that help with gassiness, for example, that might be a nice, a fun target. Or probiotics that help you deal with a little extra overdose of that wonderful alcohol from the beer or wine, right? You can imagine that's a possibility as well. So probiotics.
That's a lot of demand right now for probiotics, though. So from a market standpoint, that also would be quite attractive. So Doyle?
Yeah, well, as I was sitting here contemplating being on the camera from my home, it was how do I keep my Welsh Corgi from shedding so much? That would be a value to me. And of course, there are other dogs that supposedly don't shed, but that wouldn't be a Welsh Corgi, so I would love to have that. And it's fun questions are great because it starts with what is the challenge you're trying to solve. And so start there and then work your way back. And maybe there's a gene editing application that could help you do it really efficiently. Or maybe there's other choices that you can make and trade-offs that are out there.
I love that. Okay, Ian? Do we have an alcohol answer as well?
No. I've decided to. I did have an alcohol answer, but I decided to steer clear of that. And I go back to what one of my professors used to tell me is that nature doesn't like you. Nature is trying to kill you. And with COVID-19, I mean, we're actually living that right now. But what that segues to my answer, and it's not so much a fun one, but I think it's something that has huge benefits. And this is real. There is a single gene in all cultivated, domesticated fowl, ducks, chickens, turkeys, which makes them susceptible to bird flu. It's been demonstrated that you can actually, with a CRISPR edit, a single CRISPR edit, you can make all of those birds totally resistant to bird flu. That's a good one from a productivity point of view, but the better result from our selfish human point of view is if they don't get bird flu, they can't pass bird flu onto us. So again, it reduces the chances of nature killing us.
I love that. It definitely ties in with food security that we all need as we get towards 10 billion people to 2050. So at this point, I think we're wrapping this up. And thank you so much for all your wonderful insights, Vincent, Doyle, and Ian. On this call, there were lots of resources that were shared, and I think we're right now at a very interesting time for looking at how different entities, startups, investors, corporates can all work together to grow the impact of this technology. So thank you very much, and now back to you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you to all our viewers for some great questions and for joining us today. And that's all for this FIA Dialogues edition, but we hope you'll be back in just 3 hours' time. At 2 this afternoon, we deep dive into agritech with a close-up look at the Proteins Challenge. And so for more insights, panel debate, and the chance to ask questions in a live Q&A session, do dial in again at 2. And make sure to mark August 12th into your calendar, when you can join me for the launch of FIA TV's Food for the Future program. But until 2 today, take care, and I'll see you later.